Convener, apologies have been submitted by Councillor Marta.
Okay. Thank you. I was just checking that wasn't a fire alarm. Do we have any declarations of interest? No. Okay, thank you. Moving on to the minute of the meeting held on the 5th of March. You have the papers circulated. Are we happy to agree as a 2 minute? Okay. Is there any matter arising from the minute? No, thank you. Moving on to item 4, which is a rolling action log, and I'll go to Mr. Moody.
Thank you, Convener. And as usual, the rolling action log just sets out decisions of the executive previously where reports have been called for, and gives comments where the report is not available for its due date.
Okay, I'll open up if there's any questions in relation to the rolling action log. No, we're happy to agree. Okay, thank you. It now brings us to the Treasury Management Strategy, and I'll go to Mrs. Templeman.
Thank you, Convener. The report presented today is the Treasury Management Strategy for 24-25. Treasury Management Strategy is prepared for each financial year and is considered by Executive before referral to full Council. So I'd firstly like to take this opportunity to thank Caroline McGill and her team for all their work in preparing this comprehensive and complex document. In February, Caroline also organised Treasury Management training for members, which was delivered by Link. And that session was designed to support decision making in this area in advance of this strategy coming to members. So I've highlighted on many occasions now that the Treasury Management Code of Practice requires a minimum of 3 reports to be submitted. The first is the strategy for the year, and the Code of Practice is fairly prescriptive in what must be presented in this document. So I know it feels sometimes a bit weighty, but we are required to include a lot of the detail in there. We then have an interim review and we have a year-end outturn review. So members should note that there'll be an interim review of this document in front of you and a year-end outturn review for this document. So that gives members an opportunity to assess how well the Council's implemented the strategy. Members will have noted that in the last few years this area has become very volatile, and whilst it's been somewhat more settled recently, there remains uncertainty in the system, so I will come back onto that a little bit later in my presentation. So if I turn to the report itself, section 6 of the report on page 19 provides some economic information. And just to reiterate for members, this is important because the health of the UK economy is a key factor in setting the UK gilt rate, which is the rate that the UK government must borrow at, and that then impacts on the interest rate that PWLB will levy for new borrowing. And also the health of the economy obviously impacts on the base rate that's set by the Bank of England, which again is impacts on the short-term rate that local authorities can borrow at. So the UK economy showed growth of 0.1% in February, and that follows a 0.3% increase in January. So if that's repeated in March, that will show growth across the first quarter of 2024, and that will signal that the UK has moved out of the technical recession that we were in the latter half of 2023. Inflation has fallen more than 10%. Inflation has fallen from more than 10% last year to 4% this year, although we have previously noted that this does mean prices are still rising. And the Bank of England has indicated that it expects to reduce interest rates. We're expecting that roughly around the start of the summer. And the interest rate projections are shown on page 26 of the agenda. So all of that is positive news, but the economic growth does remain weak. The most positive projection is for growth of 0.8% this year. However, Bank of England are forecasting 0.25%. So households and businesses are continuing to adjust to the significantly higher costs due to inflation and borrowing costs, and these factors have also impacted on the council directly, as we previously discussed. So it does remain a very challenging economic environment that we're operating within. If I turn to the strategy area, The strategy in front of you collates all the Treasury-related activity that members have approved through the revenue and capital budgets and also through service concession arrangements. And the strategy is based on decisions taken in terms of the capital investment as at the 27th of March 24, and so it reflects the additional borrowing agreed at that point. And it's also important to note that the Treasury strategy covers all the borrowing and investment activity for the Council on a pooled basis. So these figures include borrowing for housing. So members will know that the Council has a rising need to borrow, and that's reflected in the HRA and the General Fund capital programmes. And we show that graphically on page 23 of the agenda, which is the liability benchmark, and that's showing a peak for borrowing around 2028-29. So the liability benchmark is designed to help us better anticipate our borrowing requirements and to mitigate interest rate risks by planning ahead. However, I would emphasise that the benchmark is at fairly early stages, so this is only the second year that we've been required to calculate it, and local authorities are still refining the calculations and the process for using that benchmark. But really it's reflecting what we already know, which is that we have a big borrowing requirement over the next few years, and we can see that through our capital programmes. The Loans Fund is shown in section 8 of the paper, which is on page 23, and as noted previously, we're required to present that information in the strategy. But I think for this report, the important part is in paragraph 8.6, which is near the bottom of page 24. And that notes that the Scottish Government issued a consultation on amendments to the Local Authority Capital Finance and Accounting Scotland Regulations 2016 at the end of last year. So we are anticipating revised regulations will come into force that will impact on how Loans Fund debt repayment is calculated, and that will impact on advances from the 1st of March 2024. So we will need to bring an update back to members on that when that's all finalised, but it will impact how we calculate loan charges, and we will have to carefully review our processes and make sure that we're implementing those regulations. So as part of this report, the Executive is asked to adopt the borrowing strategy for 24-25, and that's arguably the most significant part of the paper. Capital expenditure has been approved, as we've already said, and that's shown in section 7. And the strategy sets out the limits and the approach to borrowing that the Treasury team will undertake. So paragraph 9.6, which is on page 26, shows that the Council has a borrowing requirement of £225.6 million for 24-25. That's based on replacing all the debt that is due to be repaid and also borrowing for the capital programmes. So members will see on the table at the top of page 26 that there's a high level of short-term borrowing which needs to be repaid in the year. And that reflects the borrowing strategy, which has been to avoid long-term borrowing so that the Council isn't locked into higher rates for a longer period of time. However, as the level of short-term borrowing increases, the risks associated with that is also increasing. So we've been having lots of discussions with our Treasury advisors to map out the borrowing plans for the year ahead, and we're trying to strike a balance between those two risks. And depending on the outcomes of those discussions, we may come back to members to amend some of the limits which are shown on the table in paragraph 9.24, which is on page 29 of the agenda. And that talks about the difference, the limits between short-term and long-term borrowing. So we will update members on that in our interim review. Finally, page 29 provides information on the investment strategy. We are not carrying large balances for investment, unfortunately, and at this point we're not proposing any changes to our permitted investments, our counterparties, or the remainder of our investment strategy. So I'm happy to stop there and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. It's a hugely technical report, but I think it's also very helpful and very reflective of the current responsibilities that are put on local authorities around managing their finances, and having a clear framework to work within, I think is really important. is becoming hugely frustrating. The expected fall in inflation is taking much longer than anticipated, and getting to a time of stability, which would allow us to do some of that longer term borrowing, because it also impacts on the council's plans and decision making about where we look to invest. And we know that we desperately need to invest, particularly capital, going forward. So that's going to continue to be hugely challenging, I think, over the next few years. Because I don't anticipate there's going to be a significant change for a while to get to that stability. I'm a wee bit anxious around the loans fund and that consultation and the outcome of that, and the potential ramifications of that restructuring of the debt. Because I think there's also been some noise about what might have been a poor decision around the PFI PPP loans, and changing the capital accounting for that, because I think there's still some nervousness around that, and we will need to keep a close eye on that for any risks associated with the council, particularly as if we're going to have to implement something retrospectively for this year. So I think there's still a bit of anxiety around that. But I just want to just thank the team for the work that they've put in, because it is a hugely technical document, and being able to explain it as clearly and easily as possible is not easy, but well done to Amanda, but also to the team. I think that the training with Link was really helpful. While it may have been challenging for some, I think it's something that at some point it would be worth repeating, maybe on a specific subject part basis, to allow members to actually have a greater understanding, and that may well end up being perhaps around the loans fund and around that aspect of it. But I'm happy to move the report as is before us today, and just thank Amanda and the team. Councillor Bowes.
Okay, I'm happy to second and reserve the right to come back in.
Okay, appreciate there may well be a number of questions in relation to this, so I'll now open it up. Councillor Hannah.
Yes, thank you. No amendments, and impressed as usual by the work that you and your staff have, the other officers have done in bringing forward this report. It is an incredibly complex area. I did attend the Treasury training and was very and enjoyed it, actually, believe it or not. But I can absolutely agree with the convener that we could all benefit from further training on specific issues. I think the first question I have is around the loans fund. You say that the review will impact on loan charge calculations. Now, there's a couple of bits to it. Number one is, when are we expecting to know the detail of that? And number two is there any sense of in what way the loan charge calculations will be affected? It could be good, it could be bad, it could be desperately awful.
Thank you. So I think the point that the leader made earlier about that nervousness in Scottish Government about some of the changes that have been made to debt payments and to service concessions is valid, and what's come out of the consultation exercise from the Scottish Government is reflective of that. So if you recall, and new members may not recall, a couple of years ago we did a loans fund refinancing exercise, and so paragraph 8.5 refers to that. So it was January 2022. The council has to approve the debt repayment policy, and I've set out the revised arrangements in paragraph 8.5. Now, what that did, similar to service concessions, was it allowed us to make a retrospective change to look at how we've repaid debt if we had overpaid debt. And so there was a huge piece of work. A lot of local authorities did it. Our Treasury advisors were involved. It was very complex calculations, and we agreed that process. I think that in terms of looking at that making that retrospective adjustment and service concessions combined have made Scottish Government particularly anxious about the level of debt and debt being spread out. So what the new proposed regulations do, which I think we will have final regulations relatively soon, is say that you can no longer make those retrospective adjustments. So that doesn't affect us because we've already done it, but for local authorities that were thinking of doing it, they can no longer do it. And what it, I think, potentially says, but I have put a query in to double check, is that where we've got the bullet points where we have a flat repayment period and annuity rate that we apply to debt repayment, I think we are moving away from that, and we are going to have to repay debt based on individual assets. So sort of applying borrowing to assets and seeing how long the life of that asset is and borrowing for that period. So that's how it used to be. Then the 2016 regulations allowed us to change it to what we have in paragraph 8.5. And I think what the revised regulations do will take us back to where we used to be. So it's going to take a little bit of time to work that through, and it will be sort of year specific. So there was the original consultation suggested that becoming, and apologies, that should be 1st of April 24, not 1st of March 24. The original consultation suggested from 1st of April 2023. Local authorities were unhappy about that, so that has been changed to 1st of April 2024. So that's helpful because it's prospective, it's not retrospective. There's nothing we have to adjust for what we've done so far. But we will need to work that through for 24-25 and see how it changes how we calculate BEF.
Okay, thank you very much for that full answer. Thank you, Adrian. If I may just ask another question. The graph on page 23, looking at liability benchmarking, shows, as you've already referred to, the very high level in 2028-29, which when it's shown graphically like that can look quite spectacular. Can you say, in terms of all the issues here about the loans, the borrowing and so on, how big an impact is that going to have on our revenue budgets? And is that something that we need to begin to look at for the future?
Thank you. So at the moment, all the borrowing in here has been assumed in our revenue projections and in our financial strategy projections. So there's no shocks in here. Where there could be a shock would be, for example, if something happened to send interest rates really high, and that would mean that we will have done these projections based on a series of assumptions about where interest rates are going to go, for example, and the projects that the budgets that Paul's team will have set out will be based on assumptions around some inflationary increases and things. If there's significant changes to those, we would have to look at it in any case. But at the moment, this borrowing is assumed in our budgets. The further out you go, obviously, the more uncertainty there is. And what you can see in the graph and that kind of peak and reduction is that, what we are saying is, if you remember, for the capital programme for the general fund, we had quite a lot of projects and we had quite a lot of borrowing for 4 years, and then year 5 was just back to the rolling programmes, back to the kind of basic, almost fully covered by grant, very little borrowing in year 5. And similarly, sort of the housing investment programme assumes quite a lot of investment in new build and things, but at some point that levelling out and it's just getting back to the investment for the Scottish Housing Quality Standard and to maintain properties and things. So at the moment, we're assuming that some of those large-scale investments will come to an end and we will just be business as usual. But as we've talked about, we know that there's a capital investment issue. So it's really about continually assessing and monitoring what is affordable, what's impacting on that, where are our assumptions, And obviously the way the capital programmes work is that there's an opportunity every year to approve and amend, whether that's bringing projects forward, whether it's deferring projects for affordability reasons. You know, we've got a system that means that we can make those sort of flexible decisions. So at the moment, this is baked into the budget, but obviously 5, 6, 7 years out, it could be subject to change.
Right, thank you very much. Thank you, convener.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Spears.
Thank you. The Chancellor of the Exchequer for the UK government has not come forward with a official statement, but he's hinted very heavily that there'll be enormous tax cuts and we are out of recession and we're sailing into the sunset. Does that definitely mean we're out of recession that they never claimed they were in the first place? But you did mention that we have moved out of recession. But my question here is on page 24.8.2. Every local authority in Scotland must operate a loans fund. This is unique to Scotland. The focus, the loans fund acts as an internal bank for the council. The loans fund also provides long-term financing and the council needs to respect of capital expenditure. Does that mean we get a better rate from this bank, and must we use this bank?
Thank you. Thanks, Councillor Spears. So the official figures, the sort of final checked figures for the first quarter of 2024 don't come out until May. And so there's a bit of a lag. Sometimes there can be an announcement of what the growth has been for a month, but then there's a revision to it. So I think the January figure was originally 0.2%. It got revised to 0.3%. So May will be when we get the final figures that tell us what the growth has been for quarter one. And if we have had growth across the 3 months, then that will take us out of that technical recession. And that is what's anticipated at this point in time. But I think, just as I said, you know, the best case scenario at the moment is suggesting that growth will be 0.8% for 24-25. So it's still quite weak and still, I think, it's still quite a sort of tenuous position that we're in. Obviously, things like what happens with inflation, what happens with interest rates, how that's impacting on businesses, will all feed into that. In terms of 8.2, we don't have a bank as such, but the loans fund, which we have to use, is, I've sort of said acts as an internal bank. It's not actually a bank. And basically what that does is it just pulls all the income and all the expenditure of the council together. And what it allows us to do is borrow money that could be used for HRA, can be used for general fund. And what it also allows us to do is if we have sort of cash balances, it lets us apply those or invest those. So it pulls it all together into one pot. And it is quite I think it is a good system. It works well. That pooling arrangement, because it means that we, you know, HRA and general fund can benefit together from some of the rates that are available from likes of PWLB. But if the loans fund wasn't there, we would still be borrowing from PWLB or the market, and we would still be borrowing at the same rates. So it's more of a kind of accounting mechanism that we have to use.
So probably cynical that you don't think the Chancellor is just electioneering at present. But our bank then is based at our main bank is the Holyrood, Parliament at Holyrood. It's not delivering a great interest at the moment, especially to local authorities. But you're saying this bank is not a bank, but you pool together resources, and that resources helps all councils or just Falkirk Council?
So The council has, we bank with the Royal Bank of Scotland. That's our bank, and we get money in to our accounts in the Royal Bank of Scotland, and we will invest that money in money market funds, or we could lend it to other places if we had that kind of investment. But as I say, we don't have much of the way investment. And then we borrow, and we borrow from PWLB, and we borrow from other local authorities. And that all gets pulled together, and we account for that in that loans fund, we call it, which is what we have to do. It's in statute that we have to have that. Every council in Scotland has that same arrangement. So it is more about that kind of accounting arrangement. But our borrowing is, as I say, our short-term borrowing can be from other local authorities, for example, and our long-term borrowing tends to be from the PWLB, which is a UK.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Billy Kerr.
Thanks, Convener. Just a couple of quick questions. Colleague Councillor Mundy mentioned it at the last meeting with regards to our school portfolio, the buildings. So has, because it was something like £250 million to get them up to standard, has any of this been taken into consideration in this borrowing in your calculations?
Thanks, Billy Kerr. Do you mean for the class 98 schools that are
No.
coming in? No.
For all the schools. There's a bit of work getting done now to look at all the schools that we've got. So has any of this borrowing, any of that been taken into consideration?
I think it's been taken into consideration in as much as we have some investment in schools in our capital programme, and also when we've been looking at the benefits coming from class 98, we've been trying to identify some funds to ensure that there's sufficient money to maintain those buildings going forward. So we've not been sort of taking the full benefit from that coming in-house. We've been saying, right, there's going to be costs to this and we need to make sure they're realistic. So there's areas where we've got quite a clear plan. I think once we get all the finalised work from Polly's team, we've flagged up in our capital report that that's an area that we're going to have to come back on. And so it's not, I wouldn't say it's fully covered, but there is aspects of it which are covered, I think.
And my last question, everybody keep on saying this about the PPP schools. Has that been a bad investment for us?
Do you mean the PPP schools in the first place? I don't I don't think I really know the answer to that, other than I suppose it potentially was the difference between having schools and not having schools.
I think the challenge for Falkirk is we were the first and we maybe didn't get the best deal around the financing of it, and I think others maybe got a better deal than we did.
I'm just thinking going forward, we maybe need to look at that again, make a better deal. Thanks, Amanda.
Okay, if there are no further questions, are we content to agree the report? Okay, thank you. Moving into the next section, and it is the Domestic Gas Heating Framework 24 to 27, and this is a contract procurement, and it's purely about procurement, and it's with Mrs. Aldy. Oh, sorry, beg your pardon, Kenny.
Yep, thank you, convener. Thank you very much. And just to say thanks to Fraser McNerney, who was the author of this report. He's also online. This is his first committee, and near the end, he's always willing to answer any difficult questions that I'll not be able to answer. So, as members are well aware, I'll give a very quick overview summary of the report. Section 1 outlines the purpose of the report and replacement of the existing domestic gas heating system framework. Section 4 confirms that there's a potential total spend of £10 million over the term of this contract. It would be a 3+1 year contract. There has already been an agreement highlighted within the Housing Investment Programme that members agreed on 31st of January 2024 of a potential budget of 2.5 per annum spend, and that was agreed there. Section 5 provides information on our procurement route, term of the contract selection and award criteria, and also community benefits. Section 6 of the report outlines that we have no resource or legal implication arising from this report, and it was considered that an APIA was already completed for this through our housing investment programme. As always, I would therefore refer members back to our section 2 of the report where the recommendations are laid out, and as said, I'm happy to answer any questions with difficult ones for Fraser. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, and welcome to the meeting this morning, Fraser. As this is purely about the procurement and not about the delivery of the gas heating systems, and the reason it's before us is because of the threshold that it has to be reported to the executive. I'm happy to move the report as it is, and would ask people just to make sure that we speak to the procurement aspect of the report. Councillor Bouse.
Thank you, Convener. One, happy to second you. I'll stay that to start with. As you've said, we've had a current domestic gas heating framework which is now expired. This is one that's been done by the council themselves rather than using the set of frameworks, because there doesn't happen to be one for this, surprisingly. It's a decent surprise that Scotland Excel haven't picked up on that. It may be worth speaking to Margaret to suggest to Scotland Excel that it could be one worth bringing in as a replacement to allow the programme of work that we do on domestic gas heating to go forward. So I'll keep it nice and short. You'll be pleased to hear this morning, and I'll happily second the Leader of Council.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Bouse. I'll open it up now for questions. Councillor Spears.
Thank you. I would like to welcome this report. It's good to see that investment has been made in our gas infrastructure. We have a particularly concerning case in Grangemouth at the Kerse Bridge, where the main gas main for that section of the town crosses the areas continually on high tide, nearly flooding, and the bridge looks as though it's in repair, needs repair, as it seems to have moved 6 or 7 inches upriver.
This is not, but that's not about procurement.
No, it's about maintenance.
No, but could you? Well, I made it very clear that this report was about procurement, and I would just ask if we could maybe stick to that.
Well, that would be great, because maybe we need to look at the distribution of this main, and if we could procure a safer route, that would be helpful.
It's a gas heating framework, Councillor Spears, not a gas main. Mr. Gillespie, you want to speak to any part of that?
It would just to confirm that this is not about the main gas supply. This is solely the replacement of existing gas heating systems that are within the household. Apologies if the report's not made that clear, Convener.
Okay, thank you,
Okay,
Mr. Gillespie. Any other questions in relation to the report? No, are we happy to agree?
Agreed.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to item 7, which is participation in the Scotland Excel Framework Agreement in the supply and delivery of construction materials. And is it Robert Fotheringham that's with us to take this one?
Thanks, Convener. Participation in the Scotland Excel Framework Agreement. This is for the supply and delivery of construction materials. Section 1. This is the re-tender to supersede the existing materials agreement used by the council. This includes the supply and delivery of trade materials, the supply and delivery of road maintenance materials, supply and delivery of power tools, supply and delivery of building and timber materials, supply and delivery of plumbing and heating materials, and the supply and delivery of electric materials. These would be amalgamated into the Scotland Excel 1422 into a single framework with a lot and structure that's detailed out in section 2. the current estimate of the award would be June 24 if the Chief Officer approval process was completed. The framework would run for 3 years with the option of a further 1 year extension to 2028. The total estimate value of the contract over the potential 48-month period is £13.8 million. There are a number of community benefits by the way of a point structure where the Education Training Unit will be able to select the benefit applicable and arrange a local benefit within the council area with a supplier. Happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Robert, for that. Again, this is about procurement, not about the individual areas within which the materials are being purchased for, and it is again because of the levels of spend that has been brought in front of the committee. There are significant benefits that the council get through using Scotland Excel, and we've always been very successful in securing savings, or sorry, perhaps not savings, but best value around price, and using Scotland Excel in the past, and we're one of the ones that make most use of that, and that's why the route's been used. So I'm happy to move the report as it is. Councillor Bounce.
Thank you, Convener. As touched on before, as being the previous Falkirk Council rep on Scotland Excel, it wasn't that we did quite well on Scotland Excel with the most benefit from Scotland Excel frameworks. It was quite dramatic to see. I've not been involved for the last couple of years. I can't comment where we are just now, but I think I mentioned it a few times for those who were here last time, but exactly where we were. So I think it's right that we're doing this. Yes, cost of materials has gone up. There's various things that's coverage that's covered in here, including Brexit, Ukraine, problems, Russian oil and gas. Cost of raw materials, pandemic was severely high. I think we've been through that quite a lot. For 4 year contracts, it's kind of normal. 3 plus 1 or 2 plus 2 is the kind of normal that we would expect from that. So therefore, I see no problem with it, and I'm happy to second the leader of the council.
Okay, thank you. Put it up now, Councillor Bundy.
Thank you, Convener. The report makes clear some of the big benefits of being involved with Scotland Excel, such as economies of scale and bigger negotiating power. But are there any disadvantages to the council by being part of Scotland Excel?
Okay, I'm not entirely sure who would be best to actually answer that particular question. Robert, do you want to take that to begin with, and I'll see if there's any other comments people would want to make.
As for, I'm not aware of many things that are beneficial from this. There are a lot of local suppliers within the framework in Falkirk. We have Travis Perkins, MGM Falkirk, Martin Plant Hire, that provide local jobs. There's also a 1.2% rebate that comes back into the council from the framework as well. I'm not aware of any negatives from this because there is a lot of the labour from this supplied locally within Falkirk.
Okay, thank you. I think I've got both Mrs Templeman and Mr Moody want to come in, so you can fight for whoever goes first.
Okay, I think Robert's made some helpful points already just about the fact that there already are local employers within the framework. The considerable benefit of using our Scotland Excel framework is the national buying power in terms of the prices that come from that size of framework. There's also the fact that the work in putting the framework together is done within Scotland Excel, so it does free up some capacity within the council's corporate procurement resource as well for those contracts where we do want more local influence and shaping of the procurement process. So I think broadly the balance favours Scotland Excel for purchases of this kind.
Amanda's happy with that, content with that. Okay, thank you. Councillor Hannah.
Thank you, convener. Yes, Robert just answered the first part of my question in terms of local businesses that would be within that contract. The other part of my question was about the community benefits which are referred to. I wonder if you could say a little more about the process and how much will be able to be achieved in terms of community benefits, or is it too early at this stage?
Councillor Anna, the way it works with a point system, and depending on the financial spend, then that then sits with our ETU, who will engage with the supplier. There would be expected to be a lot of work experience placements out the community with these providers once they'd hit certain numbers of points, and that's the way that this Scotland Excel framework has been set up. So there will be a big benefit to a number of people for the placements in the community.
Thank you, convener.
If people would like a wee bit more around Scotland Excel at some point, we could probably get a briefing if people would find that helpful.
That's a good idea, yes.
Okay, thank you. We'll get that arranged. Okay, no other questions. Are we content to agree the report? Okay, moving on to our final item, which is the sale of the land at Haggs and Bonnybridge. And is it yourself, Paul, that's taking this one? Thank you.
It's myself. Thanks, convener. The purpose of the report is to seek approval for the disposal of an area of land extending to approximately 310 square metres on the northern side of the Kilside Road, the 8803 at Bonnybridge. The recommendations are set out in the report to agree to declare the land surplus to operational requirements, noting that the proposed disposal is to Dundas Heritable Tenancies or their nominee for £365,000. The proposal forms part of a wider development site with various property owners, including ourselves, with a proposal from Dundas Heritable Estates to provide drive-through restaurants, including McDonald's. The site is owned by the council as a long, thin strip of ground with some landscape and a bus stop and a narrow access to the now derelict Haggs Tavern, which will also form part of the development site. The developer, Dundas Heritable, have for a number of years been assembling the site, and it is now at a position where they wish to conclude the transaction with the council. The council's transaction has been negotiated by the district valuer and has been verified as representing best value, reflecting the uplift in value because of the council's land contribution contributing to the access arrangements for the wider development site. And I'm happy to take any questions, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kentrick. Before we move it into this, can I just remind people that this is purely on the sale of the piece of the land, and would ask people not to restrict themselves purely to that, as the other part may well be subject to a planning application, which we should not be discussing at this point and could prejudice any decision-making process on that. But I'll go to Councillor Garner.
Thank you, convener, and thank you to Paul. And you've maybe made me think about the words I'm going to say here. It'll be a sad day for many in Banknock and Haggs when the Haggs Tavern is finally demolished, along with the Gordon Arms and the Bush, were a large part of the community. Hopefully the great team behind the community asset transfer of Banknock Community Centre will help fill that void. I'm pleased to see the disposal coming forward and the generation of potential capital receipt of £365,000, which contributes to the funding of the capital programme that, as we know, enables the council to invest in roads, property, open space, etc. Deals like these are critical to generating the receipts, and in this case there is the added benefit of potentially enabling a development which, subject to planning, will see some redundant and derelict buildings cleared and the land developed, which will create jobs. I recently shared the Falkirk Herald article in this agenda item on one of the local social media pages. It received over 120 comments, which were mainly positive, focusing on the potential for jobs which could be created if McDonald's restaurant gets the planning go-ahead. There were some negative comments, and those were around parking, congestion and litter. All of these can be raised and addressed, at or when the planning stage comes to the fore. Happy to move the recommendations, Convener.
Thank you, Councillor Garner. Councillor Deacon?
Thank you. This item is a simple one, and I hope my colleagues will have the sense to see what this is. This is a sale of a small strip of land that we can't use. As has been said, this is not a planning application, nor is approval or consent to build on the land. It's simply a sale of land that we as council own. As has been said already, the land being proposed is a small strip. It contains bus stop, trees and access to an empty building. The price we're getting for this, set by the district valuer, shows best value and a competitive price. So with this, I would like to officially second the recommendations.
Thank you. I will now open it up for any questions or comment. Councillor Harrow was just first.
Yes, we have I think it's an addendum rather than an amendment to the motion. I don't know if now's the right time to bring that forward.
I think it would be helpful to hear that now.
I'm happy to begin, and thank you, Jack, for circulating. I absolutely agree. It's a fairly straightforward sale of a property that is no longer required by the council, and so we have no issue with that. There are, however, some concerns in the local community that I'm sure local members are aware of about what the use will be. As has been said, that will be dealt with through the planning process. What I think is important is that there's some benefit to be seen from the sale of this, rather than the funds that are raised going into a big pot of unspecific uses. So our amendment is that any funds raised by the sale should be allocated to the Strategic Property Review Enabling Funds to be used to support community facilities to reduce carbon emissions and fuel costs. The reason for bringing this forward is that this is a very big issue for a lot of communities. A lot of community groups are trying to look at ways in which they can take over their local facilities, and I think we should do all we can to facilitate, to enable and to support them in doing that, and particularly in the area of reducing fuel costs, reducing carbon emissions, which will enable community groups to take on facilities that are otherwise going to be closed.
Okay, thank you. Do you want someone to formally second that? And then I'm going to start a 5-minute recess.
I'll happily second that and reserve the right.
Okay, thank you. Okay, if we can take just 5 minutes or so to give this a bit of consideration, that would be helpful. Thought it wasn't. Hello, folks. Is that everybody back? Okay, thank you. I'll go to Councillor Garner just to respond to the addendum.
Thank you, convener. I have a question for Mr. Kettrick, or a couple of questions. I believe there's £3 million already allocated to this sort of a fund. Has this been earmarked, or is it undersubscribed just now? And what's his opinion on ring fencing of capital funds? Thank you.
Thanks, convener. In terms of strategic property review, there is £3 million allocated. There is nothing been formally provided to any application at this stage, but the indications are, and I think we reported that as part of previous discussions on the budget, we're currently looking at, we've not committed the whole £3 million. Applications that come forward for community asset transfers will include an ask for access to the enabling funds, but at this stage the indications are is that we will not be at £3 million at this stage. In terms of ring fencing, the general approach is whilst it can be done, and Amanda could touch on that if required, is that you don't ring fence because it removes the flexibility to direct towards priorities, and also monies can be left sitting in limbo, waiting on projects to come forward that meet that criteria, leading to slippage when there is maybe other priorities.
Thank you, Paul.
Okay, could I just maybe ask Mrs. Templeman just a wee bit about our capital and the fact that it's so pressured right now, that we really wouldn't want pots sitting underutilised?
Thank you, convener. I think the we have talked during the budget process and earlier today in the Treasury Management about the pressures that are on capital. We know we don't have enough capital resources. I do think as Paul says, we can ring fence, but there is a danger when we ring fence that if those monies aren't needed, that they will sit for a period of time unused, and it may well be that we would end up having to reallocate anyway as another priority comes up. So I suppose it's just my favourite approach would be to allocate the resources by sort of reviewing all the priorities as part of that capital budget process. And so I think if the funds are not, if the funds are not needed urgently, then my preference would be not to ring fence so that they could be applied to other projects. But
okay, thank you. Thank you. And the other thing is, if in the event that there was bids beyond the 3 million, Mr. Kettrick, how would you approach that?
Chair and convener, in the normal manner, we would come back and ask for money as part of the capital programme, and it would be for members to decide, was the SPR additional funds a priority at that time? As I say, at this stage we're still pretty much under where the 3 million. If that was to change in the future, moving into phase 3, we would come and we would ask for that additional support.
Okay, so it wouldn't necessarily be that anyone would be disadvantaged if this fund wasn't available, and there'd be a mechanism for that to be brought forward. Okay, I'll open it up now for any other questions or comments.
Just comments. I wholly agree with this, especially for the reduction of carbon emissions and fuel costs for centres that will be taken into ownership by their communities. But I would draw you to page 73.1. The recommendations of this report will negatively impact area-wide carbon emissions. So I think it's good if we put something in place if we're going to increase carbon emissions in that area. And I realise there was a great deal of concern by residents, especially on the medium everybody uses now, is called social media. So if we can offset that by making sure the money goes in the strategic property review to reduce carbon emissions and fuel costs, I think that helps.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Bundy?
Thank you, convener. Like Councillor Spears, I agree with the sentiment of the motion in the addendum in the extent of conserving buildings and reducing carbon emissions. But I don't think the ask of the addendum is the best way to actually achieve that outcome. And I think Paul and Amanda have explained why, because you're locking up capital that could be spent elsewhere on the projects with similar outcomes. And I think keeping the flexibility with the finances in mind is the best approach, but maybe taking forward the understanding that we want to conserve and reduce emissions in the process.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Nimmo?
Yep, thanks, convener. Just a quick question for Mr. Kettrick. Paul, you mentioned that the 3 million enabling funds. Can you tell us exactly how much of that has been spent to date?
There has nothing been spent to date. There has been no approved community asset transfer requests that have had an ask for those enabling funds at this stage. However, that is likely to change over the coming few months as some of our CAT applications come in, and we are aware of a few that have fairly substantial asks on that fund. But even adding those up, we're still significantly under the £3 million.
Thanks for that, Paul. Thanks for clarifying. Thanks, convener.
Thank you. Thank you. Bailey Kerr?
Thanks, convener. With regards to that, is probably for Mr. Kettrick. With regards to the piece of land, will the impact on the redevelopment of the new junction? You know, the new junction is fully funded by Scottish Government and or the junction improvement works rather than the new junction by Scottish Government and fully from developer contributions, whilst the development proposals, and again they still have to go through the planning process, are reflected in the design for the improvements to the junction, because this site has always been something that's been in the longer term envisaged would come forward. It doesn't impact on the delivery of those improvement works. Thank you very much.
Okay, no other lights on, therefore I think we go to the vote. Mr. Moody?
Could I please just sum up in response to some of the issues that have been raised?
Okay.
Thank you. I mean, I accept that at the moment there's been none of the funds used, but we are only at the end of year one of a 3-year SPR process. A large number of community groups are at early stages in their requests for community asset transfer. I know of a number of groups who are seriously concerned as to whether they can sustain community asset transfer because of the number of years that there has been a lack of investment in these properties, the number of years that things have been allowed to deteriorate. So it seems to me not unreasonable. There has already been £3 million taken out of the original £6 million enablement CAT enablement fund, and it does seem to me to be a small ask to put an additional 365,000 in to give that support to local communities. To enable them to try to do these. It could be the decision that just tips the balance is being able to get a bit of extra money to bring the community centres and other facilities up to speed.
Okay, we'll go to the vote.
Thank you, convener. The motion, which consists of the recommendations at paragraph 2, is moved by Councillor Garner and seconded by Councillor Deacon. The amendment, moved by Councillor Hannah and seconded by Councillor Patterson, has been circulated and consists of the same recommendations but with the additional paragraph 5. Councillor Bowes.
Motion.
Councillor Bundy.
Motion.
Councillor Deacon.
Motion.
Councillor Garner.
The motion.
Councillor Gardner, we didn't hear you.
The motion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Hannah,
Amendment.
Bailey Kerr,
Motion.
Councillor Meiklejohn,
For the motion.
Councillor Nimmo,
Amendment.
Councillor Patterson,
Amendment.
Councillor Spears,
Amendment.
Councillor Steenbank,
Amendment.
Convener, there are 6 votes for the motion. There are 5 votes for the amendment. The motion is carried.
Okay, thank you. Okay, colleagues, that brings us to the end of this morning's executive. We didn't quite make the hour, so apologies for that. I will try and do better, but just to thank everybody for their contributions this morning.
Thanks, Convener.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks, Convener.